Okay, so last week we spoke about getting that sense of where the sits bones are in the pelvis, so right at the base of the pelvis. And we did a seated pelvic rock variation to find that and to get a sense of the opening of the floor of the pelvis. Today, what I want to talk about is a little bit more about how to get that sense of the thigh bone connecting into the hip joint. So what I notice is that when I'm working in mat work context, which is what I do most of my time, I come across a lot of men especially, but also women who have maybe done a lot of working out in the past, and there's a lot of kind of a tendency for the thigh bone not to really sit inside the hip joint very well, and they're in this slight kind of tucked under position. This is also very common for people with lower back issues, and that they're not able to sit on their sits bones, so they feel very unanchored in their pelvis, and when they're lying on their backs, that translates into the hip flexors firing up a lot because they don't have this anchor. So instead of grounding through the base of their pelvis, they're kind of holding onto their legs like that from the hip flexors. So in a mat context, that's quite challenging to work with because a lot of the time your legs are in the air, you're lying on your back with your legs in the air and you're doing things like the single leg stretch or whatever. So I've been trying to translate some of the work we do in the studio using springs into the mat work context to try and help people have a sense of anchoring the pelvis when the legs are in the air. So for this I'm going to be using, it's a medium resistance TheraBand. If you have a strong resistance TheraBand, that's also good. If you've got a very weak low resistance TheraBand, then I would double it up at least, or else use something like a towel instead. You need something that's going to give you a little bit of something to work with, otherwise you're kind of going to grip in the hip flexors again. Okay, so we come to lying down on our backs, and so we're just going to take hold of the band and we place the band around the back of the thigh here, and we're just going to hold the band quite close here, and I could really do with something under my head, but we're going to ignore that for now. And so from here, I'm going to connect around the sits bone area, and I'm going to think of drawing the sits bone downwards to bring the leg away from my hip. And then I'm going to allow that knee to fold back in, and go again. So I'm going to engage the sits bone, and then draw that leg away from me. And then I'm going to bring that leg back in. And just to be clear, what I'm trying to do isn't just push the foot down onto the floor, because I can do that very easily just by using the lower, this part of my hamstring, and that's what a lot of people tend to overuse. So what I'm trying to get at is more of a sense of connecting. It's a little bit subtle, so if you can't feel it, put your fingers on your sits bone and think of drawing your sits bones together so you get that little bit of connection into the lower glutes and the top of the hamstring. And then I just use that to take my leg away. And then as the leg folds back in, I let it release. So connecting and take the leg away. And then what I like to do is take that into a circular kind of pathway. So I try to connect the sits bone, take the leg into the band, and then circle it around. And I like this because it really helps to define the movement of the thigh bone in the hip joint, because a lot of time people are actually moving the pelvis and the lower back instead of articulating in the hip joint itself. So I find this quite a useful way to open the front of the hip. And then reversing, so take the knee out to the side, engage the sits bone, and then draw the leg down and in. Take the knee to the side, engage the sits bone, and draw the leg down and in. And last one, knee to the side, engage the sits bone and draw it down. And then just to kind of finish off and complete that sequence, you could also include some connection. So you connect into the sits bone and then you extend the leg up, keeping that connection into the sits bone, and then you fold back in. So sits bone engages, so I'm anchoring my pelvis and then I'm extending the back of my leg, keeping that anchoring in the pelvis. And I like this because a lot of people tend to, when you extend your leg, kind of collapse into their lower back. Whereas if you can get that connection into that sits bone area, then the length is really coming from the back of the leg rather than being taken off the lower back. So sits bone engages. And it's almost like I'm bringing my thigh bone deeper into my hip joint as well. And then I like to just stay there and do some circles, just kind of driving that movement from the sits bone and then the other side or the other direction. And at this point it's quite easy to feel like you've lost that sits bone connection, so maybe just putting your finger there and helps to feel that there's something going on there, and then releasing. And then you do the other side. Okay, so have a go at that and let me know how you get on. And next week we will do a different variation on this theme. Okay, bye then.